Okay, so to better understand how these events work, I'm actually going to work through a few examples. And the first one I'm going to do is working through polling versus events. And we're going to see the two different ways of solving this problem, and we're going to actually solve the problem of double click. Oops. How do we detect and set up a double click? So we'll work with the mouse. Now, the first thing to think about is with polling, the way that it works, if you recall, is we just check if the mouse is pressed each time. Check, 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 check. Check if mouse pressed. Right? Check, 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 check. The problem with that is, of course, is you can check if the mouse is pressed, but it only really checks at that time. So you might miss an event. You might miss it. What if you missed it? Right? Because if you're not polling fast enough, if you check, I click, I release, you check again, you're going to miss that click. So I'm going to start by working through this kind of long demo. And we'll see a lot of the different pieces come into play here. So over to the desktop. Here's an example. I'm not going to get too much into this. The code, we'll see what these things do as we work through it. So I'll skip it for now. The first thing I'll do is just go over the draw function, standard draw, random move, draw shape. Because this is a polling solution, we're going to implement double click. Let's just start by thinking, how do we see one click? We ask, right? We poll. If mouse pressed, let's press mouse pressed. So that's actually pretty simple. But here we go. Here's my program. Now watch at the bottom here, the text will come up when I click. I clicked once, and look, I got 2 mouse presses. So what's happening here is, I clicked once, my click lasted long enough that the opposite problem that I mentioned earlier happened, where instead of missing it, I click once, it checks again, it fires twice. So it says mouse was pressed twice here, right? It's actually quite difficult just to get one. So that's the first problem. Now, given that you can see that at 60 frames a second, it's actually much faster than my mouse is, so it's really hard to see if I'm missing an event or not. Eventually you will miss one, but it's really hard to see. So to make it easier, I'm going to reduce my frame rate from 60 times a second to 5 times a second. So it's just drawing at 5 times a second. So it's still pretty fast, 1, 2, 3, right, 5 times a second. But it's a lot slower here, so I can still give a good solid click. Mouse pressed, mouse pressed. But I'm only getting 1, but look, click, no firing event, click, no firing, click, click, click. You know, you're missing most of them. Oh, there's one. I'm missing a lot of them. And so I just did that to exaggerate the problem. But yeah, we can miss the events. If you're polling and not interrupt driven, you can miss them. So that's one problem. So the other problem that we saw is, because I'm polling so quickly, 1 click will register multiple mouse presses. Now, of course, I shouldn't register those each as a mouse click because it's just a press. So what I do is, you start thinking up some logic. And this is the logic I came up with. So what we'll do is, every time we draw, we'll check, is the mouse pressed right now? If it is, let's also check whether we're middle of an existing click or not. So what I've done is I made this global variable called mid-click, and it's false. So it records whether I've already registered that I've started a click. So if my mouse is pressed and I'm not in the middle of a click, good. I'm not currently handling a down click, then I set that to be true, so next time I'm around, it's like, hey, it's already handling it. I print line mouse pressed, and then I'm done. The next time I'm through, I come in, mouse is pressed, but mid-click is no longer false, it's true, so it'll skip this, okay? Until mid-click becomes false. So that's where my else comes in. So if a mouse is not down, but I'm in the middle of the click, so I've started a click, but the mouse is no longer pressed, we end it. So click is over. So you see, I've had to implement this logic to detect, okay, I'm not in the middle of a click, but the mouse is down, so let's start a click, and I set mid-click to be true. And then the opposite end, I have to go, okay, the mouse was down before, I'm in the middle of a click, but it's no longer down anymore, so it registered the end of the click. So this doesn't solve the problem of missing the event, but it solves the problem of doubling up. I'm holding it down, lifting up, holding it down, lifting it up. And so it's actually quite tricky to, you might not be getting your head around what's going on here, but it's actually quite tricky. logically speaking, that you're thinking, I'm checking repeatedly, it's polling, right? So this is 60 times a second. So once I click down once, we don't want to be continuously saying at the beginning of a click. We let go. So at this spot here, you can see we can do whatever we want at the beginning of a click or at the end of a click. So we can actually do it. We can actually add this logic with polling to simulate this single click event, okay? The problem is, of course, we still might miss events. If you're quick enough, if you're doing really quick, you can still miss them. Actually, I don't think I can do it. I don't think I'm fast enough at 60 frames a second, but yeah, now that it's make it odd. No. Yeah, I can't tell. I'd have to code it differently. That's okay. So that works. Now I want to go through the polling solution of a double click. Now, a double click is just like a single click, except a few things. One, we detect 2 clicks in a row. So if I'm already in a click and if I finish 1 click, then I watch for the second click, and then 2, I see how close they were. So I made this global variable called double click speed, and don't worry too much about the math. I'm working in nanoseconds, so I'm going to say if there's 2 clicks within 150 milliseconds, I'm going to call that a double click. So remember, 150 milliseconds is just over 1/10 of a second, okay? Because there's 1,000 milliseconds in a second, so just over 1/10 of a second. And then what I do is I for the double click code, let's uncomment it. Oops. What's going on? There we go. So what I do is very similar to before. If the mouse is down and I haven't detected a click yet, then I say, okay, we're in the middle of a click. Now if I'm in the middle of a click, if I'm in the middle of a click and, come on, iPad, then I go, okay, I'm in the middle of a click. Is it the first one I saw? If it's the first one I saw, then I record the current system time. And then I calculate the difference between the current time and, I said that wrong. If it's the first click, you know what, I'm going to change my variable name. I confused myself. Good luck with you. Has first click. Let's change that. So it's not if it's my first click, if I've already seen. Okay, well, let's check here. So, okay, let's try this again. Double click code. If the mouse is pressed and it's not already starting a click, good, let's start a click. Cool. Then we see if it's our second click or not. If I already have a first click, if I've already seen one, this is my second click. Then I see how long the current system time. I compare this between my current time and the time of the first click. I just subtract them. If they're bigger than the double click speed, if it's more than 150 milliseconds, I say, let's forget it. It doesn't work. It's too far apart. Let's just start over. Otherwise, we say we got a double click. So I say we don't have a first click anymore. So I come down here. In that case, it'll actually say, oh, you haven't have a first click. I'll use this click as your first one. So we say, okay, we don't have a first click yet, so let's count this as a first click. We save the time, and then we set our global variable true, has first click to true, and we print out, I got the first click. So this is the key right there, and this is the spot where we get a double click. And then, of course, just like before, if we have to make sure that we know when the click ends. So if mouse pressed and not mid-click, then the opposite down here, we say, well, the mouse is no longer pressed, but we are mid-click, so we stop. So, are you confused yet? This is really complicated, and Boolean logic, we're polling and checking, is actually really hard and really hard to debug. So I've done a lot of this kind of stuff, so I have a lot of experience with it. See, double click, got first click, double click. It works. If I'm fast enough, that double click. It works, but the problem is it's confusing as heck. So I recommend you take some time to play with this to make sure you understand what's going on. But when you do this kind of stateful stuff with polling, it gets really tricky really quickly because you're checking. You have to keep track of where I was. Events really simplify things. So yeah, this is the polling solution. I can actually get rid of this because it's not what we're doing here. This is the polling solution. I have this box, but you can see that I can figure it out, but I have this huge messy state machine basically. If I have a first click, I don't have a first click, this will do this. If I have, you can see all the transitions just to get double click to work. And we can still miss events if my polling isn't fast enough. First click, double click, double click, double click. Right? Yeah, so polling is quite confusing, hard to work with. Now if I go back to my iPad, that was our demo too. Now events, I want to do the same thing now, or demonstrate the same thing now with events. Okay, basically instead of having to manage, am I in the middle of a click, am I not in the middle of a click, you start to trust a low-level system. So you trust the low-level interrupts and the queue. And because of that, we don't get any lost events. Anything's still possible depending on the underlying implementation, but the way event systems and interrupts are set up is generally you don't get, with a little buffer in there, you don't get lost. You don't get lost events. So let's jump back to the code, and we'll see what it looks like when we do it with events instead. So this was the polling solution. I'm going to switch over to my event version of the same, basically the event version of the same code. Now what we've done is the code's the same. We have our global variables. I'm going to change the name of this one just like last time. It has first click. And then we still have to keep track of the time. It's still double click detection. But first of all, the draw now says clean. There's nothing in here. None of this polling, none of this state management mess is in here. I just focus on drawing and walk away. Now instead, what I do is I overload the mouse functions. There's mouse pressed and mouse released. And I use those instead. So what I've done first is, I'll comment this later, but first I've just shown you that we have mouse pressed and we have mouse released. Mouse pressed, it'll just happen when the first time you push the mouse down. Mouse released, it'll happen the first time it's released. You've seen from the other code how you might implement that, but you don't have to. The event system manages it for you. So first let's just do the simple simple version here. Click over, click down, over, solid, and you can't miss it. It's hard to see because right, you can't miss it, so you won't miss it. Because of the queue, it's guaranteed. Now I'm going to comment this out, and let's look at the double click code. So what I've done is, you still have to do this kind of logic, but it's not nested anymore. It's a lot simpler. If I'm going to do a double click, let's first see if it's our second click or not. If we already have a first click, if we already have one, then let's save the time. Let's compare to the last time. If it's too slow, we say, no, you know what? We don't have a first click. Forget it. And so we back off. And then otherwise, if it's not too slow, we say we have a double click. And then down here, if I don't have a first click, then we save the time and we say, yep, we have a first click. Now the next one, let's check for a double click. So it's the same logic as before, but now you're not doing it like nested deep, and you can focus in on this simple timing issue, and you've really simplified your problem. So with the event system, you guarantee not losing your events, and the logic is a lot simpler. If I can click fast enough. There we go. Yeah, 150 milliseconds might be a bit fast. Cool. So using events, we just overload those processing functions, like I said, and then we trust the event system. Now in this case, again, in this case, we don't have any setup of setting up our listeners, because processing already does that for us. We just overload them. But when you work in Java or C# or whatever language, or JavaScript, you have to set up those listeners yourself. So the event-based approach is cleaner, simpler, scales better, and more robust. Okay, great. So we'll stop that here. I'll come back. Well, I'll go through a few more examples.